At Sync, we have long said that all environmental problems are social problems. To solve them, we must bring together an understanding of human social systems with knowledge of the natural world. Modeling provides one way to grow this understanding. It is a tool that allows researchers, policymakers, and students to explore socio-environmental interactions, potential futures, and options for intervening to enhance sustainability. Welcome, I'm Margaret Palmer, Director of Sync, and this is part one of a three-part tutorial that introduces some of the basics for socio-environmental modeling. Part one introduces the fundamental characteristics of socio-environmental systems as complex adaptive systems. Part two focuses on overcoming some of the challenges that are first faced by teams beginning to study and model socio-environmental systems. Then the third part focuses on when and why we use different types of modeling approaches. So let's start with the four basic phases of socio-environmental modeling. First, SE modeling teams have to define the problem or agree on the objectives in modeling. Not necessarily easy. They may disagree. They must set the boundaries, decide if they will engage stakeholders, and consider any other special issues that they need to discuss. Second, teams must conceptualize the problem in a system context that identifies the components or variables involved, as well as the processes that link these components. After that, specifics of the modeling formalization begin, and here's where it becomes more technical. The type of model has to be chosen, and key to this is clear articulation of the modeling goal. And of course, finally, applying the model is the fourth phase. Note that there is an arrow back to step one. This is because often the outcomes from the model motivate new questions or the need to make changes to the model. Okay, so let's dig into part one of socio-environmental systems as complex adaptive systems. The key characteristics of these are they are dynamical systems with many components that interact in ways that result in emergent system-level behaviors, also called states, and these are difficult to predict. System state or behavior is usually described qualitatively for socio-environmental systems. So given this particular image, we might talk about the socio-agro-ecosystem as providing stable livelihoods for farmers with land that is managed sustainably for both crops and biodiversity. So if the y-axis of our cartoon graph is some metric of system health, it might be represented by that highest ball on the left. But note, such states change over time, as we're going to discuss. Another general feature of socio-environmental systems as complex adaptive systems is they're characterized by high levels of uncertainty. And this is something we'll talk more about later. First, I actually wanted to mention that complex adaptive systems are actually all around us. An example that you can see every day in the newspaper or on TV is the economic market. This can be globally, regionally, and as you know, they're highly dynamic and complex. Other examples of complex adaptive systems include the central nervous system, for example, the neurons, the interactions between them, and at larger scales, of course, the interactions with the brain and even the feedbacks to the muscles. Another example for ecologists would be ant colonies. It's really fascinating to watch them. If you haven't done it since you were a kid, you should do it again. They can appear to be in a state of disarray, but then a pattern can emerge over time, and we see something more consistent that we might call the state of this complex system, namely a colony of ants with interacting individuals. Now, complex adaptive systems are actually systems of nested systems, and in the case of socio-environmental systems, these include interacting social systems and natural systems. So in this particular image, each of the three major boxes have smaller rectangles that represent subsystems with different dynamics. So for example, there might be a system of homeowners that consists of subgroups that have different attitudes or social pressures, and they may interact in ways that influence the state of the surrounding environment. In the ecological subsystem, or system shown here, different levels of the food web have different dynamics, but they interact with other food web subsystems. So in sum, complex adaptive systems are defined by a network of components linked to interactions. And the components of the social systems are often called agents or actors, and these are autonomous decision-making entities. They can be communities of homeowners, as in that last visual I showed you, but they can also be objects, institutions, governments, people, or even categories of people such as those willing to upgrade their homes. For example, let's look at this 2020 study by Melissa Etzel and colleagues. They focused on an agropastoral socio-environmental system in which farmers and cows are different agents. Through their behaviors and decisions, they together determine how much woodland area is grazed and how the area of cropland changes. As dynamical systems, the interactions and components change and evolve over time, and that change is governed by what modelers often call rules, and that simply means equations or functions. Turns out they can also even be linguistic statements. These rules or functions describe the interactions between agents, as well as between the environment and the agents or social groupings. So the functions are used to determine how the agents and the environment change or evolve in response to interactions. Adaptation or learning by the agents occurs and macro properties, that is, system-level behavior or patterns that I've also called states, begin to emerge. This characteristic is why complex adaptive systems are sometimes called self-organizing systems. The functions describing interactions are typically nonlinear. That is, the future state of a component is not directly proportional to its past state. In other words, the rules are such that the rate of change, or the slope, is not constant. Now, simple exponential growth in a population can appear nonlinear, but the function that describes it isn't. The growth is always proportional to the current state. So this is actually an example of a linear system, and thus a graph of rate of change in the population, assuming exponential growth is a straight line. Now contrast that with a different graph of state versus time. This might be saturating or logistic population growth. Here the graph of the population size change over time is also not a straight line. It's more like a funny S shape. And now the growth or rate of change is not directly proportional to the current state, but rather it increases at low state values, then decreases to zero, and it's at this point that the growth trajectory saturates to a constant value. Now that's a really simple example in which we're just looking at what may be only a highly isolated system or one component of a system that displays changes we're familiar with, namely exponential growth or saturating growth. But what about the case where changes over time in the state of a complex adaptive system look a little like this squiggly line? It's not so easy to characterize its behavior. But what I can say is that it is likely due to a lot of nonlinear interactions between components that have multiple feedbacks. It'd be pretty difficult to write an equation that describes its state over time. While its behavior is very complicated, it does not mean that complex adaptive systems change randomly. It simply means predicting their behavior is difficult. Such predictions may be possible in the short term, but there's low predictability in the long term, at least using current methods and tools we have today. So a quick recap. Complex adaptive systems can have many components. They can change a little and produce very different behavior or states in the overall system. So let's delve more deeply into a socio-environmental system example. And let's start with one in which state changes can be actually traced to some triggers. Now I'm going to use an example I've fictionalized a little. It concerns a rural socio-environmental system in Indonesia. Initially, its state could be described as one in which prosperous people are living sustainably in a forested system. They depend on timber from the forest for income, but they also depend on the forest for farming. So you can see that rice is actually grown in and amongst the forest, and both trees and crops are prospering. However, if the government changed a policy that resulted in a shortage of land to farmers, we can see some immediate social impacts. With less farmland available to them, they have less to sell at market. And what this does is to increase their poverty. And this, in turn, leads to households logging in areas that were formerly off limits. And that's because some of the wood can be sold for income that they've lost from farming, but they also typically burn some in their homes for cooking. So this extra logging leads in turn to less forest, and that makes it increasingly harder for the villagers to get income. So poverty is further increased, and you can see that feedback. In other words, the onset of poverty initially due to a policy change influenced the future state of the people, that is worse, poverty, and the future state of the forest, which is now smaller and also more degraded. I might add that with deforestation, the feedbacks that degrade the system socially and environmentally are further exacerbated by other feedbacks within the biophysical parts of the system. Specifically, changes in hydrology due to deforestation lead to reduced soil health as well as reduced forest regrowth. So that little example illustrates how one change can have cascading effects throughout all parts of a complex system. It also provides an example of an entire socio-environmental system moving in a new state. The people, the natural resources, and their interactions became very different. Its behavior emerged over time. Again, this is called its emergent behavior. The patterns, properties, or characteristics that emerge over time are due to the interactions, feedbacks, and resulting changes. This characteristic of complex adaptive systems in which internal changes in the system result in emergent properties is why I mentioned earlier that they're sometimes called self-organizing systems. And once again, I note that while these systems aren't fully deterministic, they aren't just randomly organized. So we do work to build models that can at least approximate the system dynamics. Identifying the functions, though, to use in a model like this is non-trivial, but there are strategies that can be used to help. For example, you can rely on expert opinion to guide the selection of a functional form that describes a particular relationship in the model. Or there may be accepted equations already out there if it's a process that's been extensively studied and we have a general idea of its dynamics. Alternatively, if we have the access to data, we can analyze it and actually derive the functions that describe those linkages. It's worth mentioning that you can also get very big and unexpected changes in states. You may have heard these called regime shifts. While this can certainly happen after a major shock or disturbance, say an earthquake, it can also happen after there are only relatively small changes in part of a system that is near some system threshold, and it can be difficult for a system to recover from these. Many examples of regime shifts exist for complex adaptive systems. I remember well the 2009 collapse of the housing market, or the so-called housing bubble, and that's a good example. In a very short time period, the value of houses dropped by a huge amount. There's also many examples for ecological systems. Often we hear about coral reefs shifting from healthy states to highly degraded states in which algae cover the corals. And in many cases, this appears to have resulted from climate change with associated ocean acidification, but also coastal pollution. For SE systems, classic examples of regime shifts include when humans purposefully or accidentally introduce a non-native species. And this has resulted in explosions in pests such as Drosophila suzuki, the spotted fruit fly. It's actually wreaking havoc on summer fruit crops like grapes, blackberries, and peaches. In fact, in Maine alone, there's major economic losses expected due to impacts on wild blueberries. Lost livelihoods will result, and this will result in changes socioeconomically, and spread of the pests will have impacts on the ecosystem, including the potential for a major regime shift. Now, identifying the mechanisms that lead to changes at the overall system level is a major area of ongoing research. So in the last example, only one aspect of the system was changed. A new actor was added, the invasive fruit fly. But changes occurred at the system level, and quite often these are due, again, to the interactions and feedbacks, which can cross different levels of spatial and temporal organization and are very common for SE systems. a major challenge for researchers to deal with. Cross-scale interactions often occur between small-scale components and components operating at larger scales. For example, between actors or organizations at the community level and those at regional, national, or global scales. Feedbacks that span time domains involve interactions between components that change very slowly versus those that change quickly. Let's take an example. In the last few years, we've heard a lot about increase in wildfires in California, Australia, Indonesia, and other areas. While climate change can be contributing, human actions can also be blamed. As people build closer and closer to remote fire-prone regions and land management shifts, human lives and property loss are increasing. So more and more attention is now being paid to how to reduce these impacts. This is a classic socio-environmental problem. Paige Fisher, a social scientist at the University of Michigan, studies human behavior as it relates to the sustainability of SE systems, and she actually published a paper in which she illustrates the scales at which social and ecological processes operate, using wildfires as an example. So here's a graph from her paper. Now, just to orient you, on the x-axis is the spatial scale at which different processes take place, while on the y-axis are the temporal scales. Now note that the beginning and spread of wildfires occurs over days to weeks from the scales of local patches to entire landscapes. Yet tree mortality from pests and disease occurs over much longer time scales and influences much larger areas. Now remember that all of the processes in an SE system like this are coupled human forest fire feedback effects on one another. So for example, drought stress, which occurs on decadal scales and over a broad region, influences the start and spread of a fire, which is a local process. But consider the scales at which social processes, such as the shifts in values, occur. Note the mismatch between them and the time scales at which fires spread and when management and planning change. Given these temporal lags and differences between biophysical and social processes, it's really not surprising that we tend to see environmental degradation long before actions are taken to halt or reverse it. In fact, it turns out that human behavior is such that perception of risk and thus actions to reduce it is influenced by many factors, and one is the recency and frequency of events such as fires. I mention this because human behavior is an active area of research in which we're trying to bring that into socio-environmental models much more dynamically. In this particular fire example, absentee or new homeowners that do not have a memory of fires will be less likely to remove fuels like underbrush that helps increase the blaze. It may take years of experience with repeated fires before they're motivated to do things to reduce that risk. But even if they remember the event, taking an action depends on what other options are available. They may view fire risks as an acceptable trade-off given the costs of removing underbrush or changing their landscaping or installing some sort of a system to minimize fire. Given how complicated human decision-making is, I guess it shouldn't be surprising to you that it's hard to incorporate into models. In fact, scholars in diverse fields, including psychology, sociology, economics, and others, have developed many formal theories of behavior and behavior change. Any of these could be used to inform the decision rules or functions in a model. Ideally, though, the model would be run assuming different theories in order to compare how the selection of theories influences the system's dynamic. And this is important because we know no one model is probably perfect, especially when you make different assumptions about things like behavior. And this is just one thing that could be varied in a model in which there's insufficient empirical data to help in developing the functions that describe the interactions between components. So thus far, I've covered socio-environmental systems as examples of complex adaptive systems, with the key characteristics of these being lots of components that interact, including nonlinear feedbacks and cross-scale interactions, both spatially and temporally. All of these internal dynamics together lead to the potential for multiple states to evolve or emerge, so the system behavior overall is very hard to predict. Before I close, I want to thank quickly the core group that designed the overall modeling series on socio-environmental systems. They're a great group to work with. They span countries and disciplines, and each of them are very accomplished researchers with enthusiasm for modeling. In closing, I want to particularly encourage you to move on to part 2 video in this tutorial series on building the basics. Thanks and take care.